Hey Scott, how's it going?
Good, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We're in the process of selling our house and buying a house.
Nice. That's exciting.
I mean, this place is could not be any smaller. It's like under 1,000 square feet.
Wow.
Yeah, which all the kids, we have 3 kids and sort of packed into one room. Are you guys planning on having any kids?
We're not, Steve.
No.
We're kind of
Yeah, that's good. Just enjoy your life.
yeah. We got together a little later in life, and I don't want to be thinking about retirement and college at the
Yeah,
same time.
exactly.
Um,
Thanks for rubbing that in.
yeah.
We So today we have Project Manager Scott Abate with us to talk about the basics of Scrum and Scaled Scrum and how they relate to Agile software development and why they're important in enterprise mobility. All right, I've just got this little spiel that I wrote up here. Hello and welcome to Device Squad, the enterprise mobility podcast from Propelics. Device Squad, fighting crimes against enterprise mobility worldwide. Bad UI, frustrating user experiences, poorly conceived mobile strategies, we defeat them all. This podcast series will cover all aspects of enterprise mobility, including strategy, development, design, testing, and more. My name is Steve Brickman. I'm a mobile strategist and UX architect with Propelics. First, a brief history of the company. Founded in 2011, Propelics is a mobile strategy consultancy helping enterprises worldwide devise true mobile strategies and develop world-class mobile applications across all industry verticals. Propelics clients include large companies like Amway, Bright Horizons, Bank of Montreal, Dubai Airports, Family Dollar, DLL, Cintas, Merck, and many more. Propelics' menu of services includes 8 different mobile kickstarts, covering everything from mobile strategy and road mapping to MCOE to UI UX design to mobile testing strategy, along with soup to nuts app design development and support. Additionally, Propelics offers 3 homegrown enterprise mobile products. So, Scott, you've been with Propelics for a couple of years. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to work for Propelics?
Of course. Well, I've spent a career of 20 plus years in software development. And most recently, a lot of my time has been concentrated around project management for Agile software development teams. That has allowed me to focus on all areas of Agile software development and specifically working with smaller teams and most recently with Propelics in the mobile context.
You wanted to come on board here to talk about the basics of Scrum, what Scrum is all about, what it means to scale Scrum, and how it relates to Agile development. So why don't we start with a definition of the differences between, Agile development versus waterfall development and maybe the benefits of one over the other.
The primary difference between the more traditional waterfall approach and the more recent agile approach to software development is waterfall is predictive, whereas agile is adaptive. And once again, the difference between predictive and adaptive is the predictive processes, you do the same thing over and over again and accumulate history and experience, and therefore you are able to predict the future outcomes with a greater sense of accuracy based on your experience. The adaptive processes, once again, Agile being an adaptive process, will change over time. There are learning processes. There are processes that the teams will use and then inspect on a periodic basis. And after that inspection, they will make changes to the process in spirit of improvement. So adaptive processes change over time. Therefore, the experience is different each successive iteration, each successive go. And it is as the improvements are introduced, the processes are new and different. And again, the hope of each change is that it will make the process perform better.
It's interesting. It seems like these days all we hear about is agile, and it's just a very hot process. And I just wonder, what was it that really sort of forced the changeover from waterfall to agile?
Sure. So many organizations these days are practicing agile software development under the promise of a greater emphasis on customer focus, value focus, and much earlier delivery of value in the software. It is a riskier approach to software development in the sense that the propensity to fail is much more prevalent. But again, that is one of the underlying themes of agile software development, and that is to try new things and fail fast. The idea there is once you fail and you can learn from that experience, you can change or improve that process or that product over time. So these are some of the promises that come along with agile software development and have prompted many organizations to switch over to agile from the more traditional waterfall approach. Once again, the waterfall approach is the more predictive model of software development where you do the same process over and over again, and you leverage your experience with that process to hone that process and have it perform for you better over time. In software development, I also believe that there have been a lot of organizations that were not getting the results that they had hoped from a waterfall or a predictive approach. Therefore, they've tried out agile software development as an alternative and may have found some of these promises to deliver, specifically around being more customer focused, more value focused, and also getting valuable software out into the hands of users much earlier than perhaps the waterfall approach.
Have you worked in a waterfall environment in the past?
Absolutely. I cut my teeth in project management using a waterfall approach or using a predictive software development approach. And I spent over 10 years in exclusively waterfall software development processes.
I just wanted to know if back in your waterfall days, if there were any problems that you experienced with the waterfall process that were specific to that process, and if you ever found yourself wishing that there was a more flexible way of doing things.
Sure. So the most common issue with the waterfall approach to software development was cost overrun and missed dates. The promise of agile software development was to turn the traditional iron triangle of cost, scope, and schedule on its head and have a fixed schedule, fixed cost, but the ability to negotiate scope. Therefore, the result would be a much more predictable schedule. And there's the irony of agile software development, is your delivery becomes more predictable because you time box and commit to a specific date. But what is negotiable, what is malleable, becomes the scope of what you do. So the promise of Agile was that you would deliver consistently on time, which also was directly correlated to being on budget. But the big difference when compared to the more traditional waterfall approach is that in an Agile approach, you negotiate your scope. You negotiate specifically what will be released on that date. It was all that we knew. It was the accepted best practice across all of software development. And we didn't know of anything else to try out. So really the predictive model developing software, a defined process that you follow over and over again. Despite the fact that each project is unique, we still in the past had adhered to and followed a singular process to develop software. And of course, there were always opportunities for process improvement, however, not as dramatic as we see with an adaptive agile software development approach, where that change is actually encouraged and promoted.
I see. So why don't we talk about Scrum a little bit? What is Scrum exactly, and how does it relate to agile development?
Sure. Scrum is a process framework, simply put. It's a lightweight, iterative, adaptive software development process. It works best when teams are small, generally 7 members or less, and those teams are composed of autonomous generalists. And what I mean by that is people who have the skills not only to develop software, but also to test that software. And also, when I say autonomous, meaning they are fairly independent of one another. And that is when Scrum works best, with small, autonomous teams that are composed of mostly generalists. When we start to diverge from any of those attributes of a Scrum team, then that's when we start to introduce some challenges where Scrum by itself may not be the most appropriate approach. And specifically, those scenarios are when we start to scale those teams. When teams become larger than 7 members, when you have several teams working in concert together for a single project, notably in the program scenario, when you have several different project teams or Scrum teams that are all working together in a single program. Also, when you have teams of specialists as opposed to generals, specialists being those team members who have a specific skill set that is part of the value chain, part of the development process. And the best example of this is when you have teams where you have specific developers and you have teams of testers. So when you start to introduce specialists, then you start to divide up the labor across different people, and you still need to follow a process and move work from one person or one team member to the next. When you do that, you introduce a dependency relationship or relationships between team members. There again, the more relationships you have between team members, the more challenging it is to use just the Scrum model exclusively. And that's when we start to see such concepts that are described in Scrum at scale. Meaning when you go beyond that single team of 7 members, when you go beyond that team of generalists and you start to see specialists on teams, and when you go beyond more than one team that have relationships or dependencies between those teams.
And so would other examples of teams be like a design team, an integration team?
Absolutely. Those are great examples. A marketing team, a training team, a testing team, a support team.
Okay.
All of these different specialists along the value chain or the production process or production line, if you will.
And I was just looking up Scrum because I assumed that it stood for something, but apparently it's actually a rugby term that just means that it's a move in which the team acts together to get the ball from one end of the field to the other.
That's right. It is more metaphorical than anything, and it does represent the collective effort of the team towards a common or a single goal.
And what is it that makes Scrum and the Agile process particularly suited for mobile app development, and even if relevant, enterprise mobile app development?
Sure. So Scrum is an excellent process model to be applied in the mobile context because generally mobile development teams are fairly small. So we talked about some of the best attributes of a high-performing Scrum team is number one, a small team. Mobile software development efforts are generally pretty small. The second is the fact that we have generalists on a team, meaning we have developers and testers and designers as much as possible all rolled up into a single individual. And we do see some of that across mobile development. However, more recently, we're starting to see design being split out and the mobile testing discipline starting to develop into a distinct role. So we are starting to see that the concept of a generalist on a Scrum team is becoming something of the past, and we're starting to see more specialists. Hence our conversation today around scaling. The other attribute that we speak about is autonomy. Mobile development teams and specific mobile apps, when first introduced, a lot of them were completely independent pieces of software. They did not have a service layer that they had consumed. They did not have a back end. Most mobile apps performed a specific function. However, more recently, we have started to see mobile apps being just another gateway or just another client to an integrated system. There we started to see the concept of the autonomy of the Scrum team being challenged as well, which once again is another reason that we're talking about Scrum at scale or scaling Scrum today. So for those reasons, where we see the teams getting larger as mobile apps become more complex and more a component of a much larger integrated system, we start to see mobile teams getting more specialized as we see UX and design being split out into its own distinct discipline, as we see mobile development being part of a greater architecture that also includes service development and back-end development. And we're also seeing the testing discipline specifically for mobile being split out into an individual who specializes in particular challenges around testing on a mobile device. Now, the reasons for a scaled approach to Scrum is that when you start to become more specialized, when you start to become bigger, and when you start to become more dependent on other team or team members that may not necessarily be part of your immediate Scrum, we do introduce the need, or we do find the need for techniques and scaling Scrum beyond just the immediate team.
So to get a little bit more into the specifics of scaling Scrum, how does one go about scaling Scrum? What does that entail?
Sure. So there are a number of options, a number of techniques, and there are several evangelists, bloggers, writers, coaches, all in the Agile community who have developed different approaches to scaling Scrum. And I'll mention just a few of them. For example, a gentleman by the name of Craig Larman came up with something called large-scale Scrum, and the acronym there is LESS. And I believe his tagline is do more with less. There's another option out there by a gentleman by the name of Dean Leffingwell called the Scaled Agile Framework, and the acronym there is SAFE. Once again, the Scaled Agile Framework. And then the folks over at Scrum Inc. came up with something that they have branded Scrum at Scale. And I believe they do Scrum and the @ at scale. The folks at scrum.org, specifically backed by Ken Schwaber, one of the original inventors of the Scrum process framework, They came up with something called Scaled Professional Scrum, and also the Nexus framework and Nexus Plus. And yet another example is something by Scott Ambler called Disciplined Agile Development. The acronym there is DAD, D-A-D. And those are just some, to name a few. And of course, the Scrum process itself, which was originally created by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, they had put a provision in for what they refer to as the fractal coordination of several Scrum teams. And they have a concept in there called the Scrum of Scrums, which is essentially a hierarchical relationship between several different Scrum teams. Each Scrum team picks a delegate, and every delegate from each Scrum team will get together for their own Scrum. So you can start to see a hierarchical relationship there. And that is one provision that was put into the original Scrum process framework. But as you just heard from the other examples I mentioned, there are several other tools and techniques that are available for organizations today to use when scaling their Scrum practice.
Wow, that's a lot of options. I didn't expect there to be so many different variations on Scrum. Can you take a few minutes and discuss each of those individually and describe some of the differences and similarities between them?
Absolutely. The common theme behind all of the approaches to scale Scrum is how do you manage dependencies or relationships between teams in the production line. And that is really the primary requirement, primary driver, the thing that every organization needs to be concerned the most about. Is the relationship between, or the relationships between Scrum teams. So there needs to be a tool or technique available to help the teams identify and manage these relationships. So, for example, with large-scale Scrum, with less, there are quite a few what the Agilists will call ceremonies and artifacts that facilitate the coordination between the different Scrum teams. And that is one of the primary characteristics of less. And less is about coordinating the different tracks or different teams towards a common goal. Mm-hmm. When we talk about scaled agile framework, this here again, the underpinning or the foundation of the scaled agile framework is a large emphasis on a coordination layer. And a lot of the events, the ceremonies, and artifacts designed for scale agile or safe are about coordinating efforts between the different Scrum teams, the different discrete Scrum teams within a program. The best example of this is a common backlog that each team draws from. For the Scrum of Scrums, which I spent a moment before sort of describing, Scrum of Scrums is a provision of the original Scrum process framework where each Scrum team will choose a delegate that will participate on another Scrum team or standout, therefore representing a hierarchical or almost like a pyramid of relationships. And the idea there is that delegate will handle the coordination between teams. When we look at scrum.org and what Ken Schwaber and his group have come up with is the scaled professional Scrum, which the premise is before you want to start to scale Scrum, you want to make sure that you've mastered a single Scrum team. And there are concepts in scaled professional Scrum that allow teams to measure their mastery of the Scrum process. And then once you have mastered Scrum, you can introduce the Nexus framework, which is very much a way to manage dependencies between the different Scrum teams. Scrum at Scale, coming from the folks over at Scrum Inc., talks about modularizing goals and having inputs and outputs for every module. A different way, once again, to rally a team or several teams around a common goal. And then the last one I had mentioned was Disciplined Agile Development, the DAD, by Scott Ambler. And here again, the probably the most prevalent concept in DAD is guidance through process. And once again, a prescribed process to have a disciplined approach to agile software development. Again, a process emphasis that will allow teams to use a consistent process across all teams.
Well, so some of those differences seem pretty subtle. How do you think it happened that there are so many variations?
Well, that's an excellent question. There are a lot of different variations for scaling Scrum. In my opinion, I believe a lot of organizations out there saw benefit and from adopting the original Scrum process framework, but were sort of left on their own to figure out how to scale Scrum process framework. So a lot of these individuals and smaller consortium of folks got together and devised their own approaches. And all of this work was going on at the same time. So as Scrum practices matured, as organizations were using more and more Scrum, and as they were identifying the need to scale those Scrum teams, they all sort of came up with their own way or own flavor of doing Scrum at scale. And it just happened to be that they all were published or introduced, all of these approaches of scaling Scrum about the same time. They are very subtle differences between the group, but once again, there are differences. So I would encourage organizations to examine the differences between them, look at a couple of different options, and then choose the right process, the right fit for a specific program.
What's your personal preference? Do you find that at Propelics you will use one version of Scrum for a particular job and another version for another job, depending on the type of work it is, whether it's desktop or mobile, or whether we're updating somebody's software or creating software from scratch? How do you decide which version of Scrum you're going to apply?
Sure, Steve, great question. So of all those scaled Scrum options that I had mentioned, and that's our short list, there are more, but of all those options, which do we prefer? Well, the answer to that question is it really depends on the client. We work with a lot of large organizations at Propelics, and a lot of those organizations have adopted a Scrum process of their own or a Scrum practice of their own. And they have also made some attempts at scaling Scrum within their organization. So we do encounter quite a few large organizations that we work with that have already chosen a path. One of the 5 that I have mentioned, or sometimes even an alternative that I did not discuss. And for those clients, we, in most cases, will adopt the scaled Scrum approach that they have adopted. And the reason why we're able to fold in our Scrum practice very easily into their larger program is because we still, as mobile developers, we still maintain pretty small teams. We still try to maintain the concept of generalists as much as possible. And we still try to keep our teams as independent as possible. So we're still able to operate in our normal Scrum process framework as prescribed by our internal processes at Propelics. But we, in most cases, can fit neatly into a larger program that has scaled its Scrum. And once again, because Scrum at scale, the big components of scaling Scrum is how to manage the relationships between the individual Scrum teams. Whereas the basic building block of these programs is still the Scrum team itself that follows the original Scrum process framework. So a lot of times we fit neatly into a scaled Scrum environment just because we have our own Scrum practice, and generally we're able to participate as a delegate in some of the other coordination activities where we speak about relationships between the individual Scrum teams.
You brought this up, scaling Scrum. You brought this topic to my attention for the podcast, and I admit I had not heard of scaling Scrum. And why is this suddenly sort of a hot topic? How is this becoming more relevant to agile development these days?
So Scrum is over 15 years old, and as a lot of organizations adopted Scrum over the last 15 years and practiced Scrum, they became better and better at it. And as they started to become better at Scrum, they started to realize some of the benefits of a more customer-focused, value-oriented approach to software delivery. And as they started to realize those benefits, they started to broaden their Scrum practices, meaning they rolled out Scrum to additional teams within the organization. They started to have a wide-scale adoption of Scrum across these organizations. And as they started to scale their Scrum practices, they recognized an additional need to manage the relationships between those teams. And as those needs started to surface, many organizations started to look for scaling Scrum options. And luckily, a lot of Scrum at scale or scaling options to scale Scrum became available in the recent years. And now, as those organizations have matured their Scrum process, have gone through a wide-scale adoption, now these organizations are looking to select a framework that will allow them to consistently scale their Scrum practice and maintain their Scrum practice quality and the benefits that they were earning from good Scrum at scale. So the more recent training, blogging, and general buzz around the community has been specifically around Scrum at scale. We've had a pretty wide-scale adoption of Scrum in the software development community, and now the focus is really how do you scale Scrum. So you'll notice a lot of new training offerings, a lot of new publications, and a lot of news and blog content has really been around the several options available to scale Scrum. And that's been the recent trend in the recent years.
I see. So as we discussed, at one time Waterfall was the way to go, and then Agile came into prominence, and now we're talking about Scrum and scaling Scrum. So what do you think is going to be the next phase in the evolution of mobile development? What sort of problems with Agile are going to be rectified in the next big thing?
Great question, Steve. And I'm going to go out on a limb and I'll dust off my crystal ball and look out into the future. And based on my 20 plus year experience with software development, the one thing I've seen that remains consistent is everything will go full cycle. So whereas we started in a waterfall approach, or I started my career in a waterfall approach, and I've seen a huge ground shift into agile software development, I truly believe that we will swing back the other way,
Really?
back towards a waterfall approach.
Wow.
And we're starting to see this with scaling Scrum. Once again, as we scale Scrum, the big component that was missing from the original Scrum process framework is how to manage dependencies and the relationships between teams. Well, we know that a waterfall approach to software development does just that, and it manages relationships very well, identifies those relationships, records them, and manages them. So I think as we start to see more and more activity and more experience around scaling Scrum, I think we'll eventually end up back to the place where we started, which was waterfall development.
Wow, that's really interesting. And how do you think this will benefit mobile development? Assuming
Sure.
that it would.
Mobile development is going to become just another client. The mobile platform is going to be the client and just another client for all of these complex integrated systems that now have been exposed over services. So we still will have the traditional software architecture where we have a few different clients that will essentially access the same information. And mobile is just another one of those clients. And as mobile software development becomes a much more integral part to some of these larger, complex, and sophisticated systems, we will then start to discover the need to manage more and more relationships across several different teams. And those teams may be comprised of specialists. In this case, there may be mobile specialists versus back-end specialists versus data specialists. And Scrum at Scale will help teams maintain a Scrum practice and also allow for those relationships between the client teams and the back-end teams.
Well, that's great, Scott. Thanks again for hopping on board for this discussion about agile development and the Scrum process. I'm sure you've heard this before, but you have a very calming manner, which we haven't talked about as being part of the agile development process, but you just have such a soothing, way about yourself, and you always seem to be completely even keeled no matter where the project is at. I found you to be like a weathered sea captain on a ship that's out in stormy waters at times, and I've always appreciated that.
Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate the compliment. In times of a lot of emotion and reaction, there is definitely a need for the voice of reason, voice of objectivity, and servant leadership. All of which are attributes of a good Scrum Master or facilitator of the team.
Do they teach that when you take a PM course, or is that just something that comes naturally?
Absolutely, servant leadership is a big component of learning to become an effective Scrum Master.
That's awesome. Is there anything I left out?
No. Once again, to the community of listeners, it is important to know there are several options to scaling Scrum. And I would encourage everyone to do some research and learn about each of these different approaches, the ones that we've mentioned, and there are a few others that were not mentioned in this discussion. And most importantly, choose the right scaled Scrum framework for each organization, and even choose the right approach for each program. One of the biggest lessons that I learned is that one size does not fit all, and every project is unique. Therefore, it is advisable to look at each project, each program, and choose the right tools to do the job. And that oftentimes will include the process framework and scaling approach that is chosen.
Well, thanks again, Scott. Great discussion, and I'm sure a whole lot of folks out there will find this very useful.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss Agile software development, which is a passion of mine. And I hope, as you mentioned, I hope our listeners find this session to be valuable. And I know that there is going to be some additional reference material included along with this podcast. So I hope everyone takes a chance to go through some of those materials and become more familiar with the myriad of scaling Agile or scaling Scrum approaches.
Yeah, be sure to check that stuff out. If it's not accessible through iTunes, you'll be able to get to it through our website, probably in our blog posts related to this podcast. And everyone, thanks for joining in. And stay tuned for the next episode of Device Squad, the Enterprise Mobility podcast from Propelics. Goodbye, everybody.
That was just our practice run, right?
Yeah, that was just the practice. We'll do the real one now.